Pajashig, welcome. Welcome to Indigital Insights. Monique Manach, Indigenous, Kittikanik, Anishinaabeg, and Ojibwa. My name is Monique Manach, and I'm from the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And today's discussion is with Jonathan Dewar. Jonathan is the CEO of the First Nations Information Governance Center. And the FNIGC deals with information, it deals with data sovereignty, it deals with research. It's amazing what the center covers and how it benefits First Nations communities. What were you there right from the beginning, Jonathan?
No, the organization has been a standalone organization for 15 years, and I joined in 2017 with a short 18-month hiatus when I went over to the Canadian Museum of History, and then came back in January of 2024.
They must have been really glad to see you back.
Oh, I'd like to think so, yeah.
I was.
Good to hear.
What sorts of things does the center focus on?
So I talked about us being a standalone organization for 15 years, but the work is actually much, much older. So, I mean, if people know FNIGC, typically they know the national survey work we do. So the Regional Health Survey, the RHS, which is a national region by region by region, 10 regions survey where the information is rolled up to a national level, and FNIGC is the steward of that data. And then, of course, we report out on that data. We have two other national surveys, which, of course, I can talk about at length as well. But as I was saying, if people know us, it's probably because of that work, which actually goes back to the mid-1990s. And so all of this information is on our website, but as a really quick précis for listeners, in the mid-1990s, Canada opted to leave First Nations out of three major population surveys because working with First Nations on reserve and in northern communities was hard. So expressions of sovereignty were challenging for the government of the day. And so the decision was made to leave First Nations out, which of course is a huge challenge for First Nations when there's already a dearth of information and you need quality information to make informed quality decisions. And so First Nations leadership, including the thought leadership of the day, took that challenge and, did what good leadership does. They turned it into an opportunity, which was to advocate for First Nations-led approaches to information collection, information analysis, dissemination, et cetera. So the full life cycle of that kind of initiative. And so in 1998, it was piloted. It was First Nations and Inuit. Initially hoped to be a longitudinal survey. That proved to be sort of impossible, certainly with the level of funding the government was willing to invest. And so the initial pilot was First Nations and Inuit, and then First Nations and Inuit determined they would go their own ways. And what we now know as the Regional Health Survey, which is we're just wrapping up the fourth iteration. So these are 5-year cycles. With COVID, this one's taken closer to 6.5. But we will be, in the next few months, reporting out on the fourth full iteration of the Regional Health Survey. So that's the major reason that people know us. And what accompanied that work was the development of what you know as the First Nations Principles of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. So back in the day, when people were thinking about what does it mean for First Nations to lead this work by First Nations for First Nations, what are the ethics of doing this work? In those conversations, what developed was the need to talk about a set of principles. And so ownership, control, access, shortly thereafter, possession became the crux of the conversation. And so that group who led the work back in the mid to late 1990s landed on this expression of principles. And so this is truly a by First Nations for First Nations development. And so, we're coming up on 30 years of OCAP principles being in existence. And, I say that with a lot of excitement, a lot of humility too, to have come to this work in this role in 2017. Of course, as a researcher, I had been very familiar with OCAP and had to apply OCAP in my own work. And in the different national Indigenous organizations I worked for over the years, it was always front and center. So to come to the organization that was given the mandate to be the stewards of those principles, along with the stewards of information that is collected from First Nations communities, it's a huge privilege and huge honor. But all these years later, we are still answering the basic questions to both First Nations audiences and, of course, non-First Nations audiences, anyone who would work with First Nations, about what is OCAP, what is it not, where do we go with OCAP once we've learned about it. So we offer awareness, education, and training activities very formally. We have an online Fundamentals of OCAP course. A new version came out in 2023, which I had the opportunity to help develop before I went over to the museum. And yeah, to have come back after being away for a little bit and pick up that work, but also importantly, this work we're doing to implement a national First Nations data governance strategy is just, that's just super exciting.
Absolutely. It impacts every aspect. I mean, not just with research, but anything online.
So information is everything, and First Nations data sovereignty and the OCAP principles apply to information. So there's an argument to be made that these things apply to everything. Now, it's important to note that when we talk about First Nations data sovereignty or information sovereignty, of course, that follows First Nations sovereignty. So first and foremost, it is nations are sovereign. They assert their sovereignty, and within that assertion is the assertion of sovereignty over their information. Now, you know very, very well that Indigenous data sovereignty has blown up as a term in the last decade, internationally as well as domestically. We have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, within which Indigenous data sovereignty figures prominently. So it's been fantastic to hear that the world is sort of caught up with this terminology and the concepts, the theories, the concepts, the practices beyond that. But it's also problematic because, of course, what does Indigenous data sovereignty mean when Indigenous, in the domestic context anyways, is the latest collective noun for the distinct peoples of Canada, First Nations, plural, Métis Nation, they may say plural, and Inuit. And again, plural in certain contexts as well because of the different Inuit regions, right? So all of these complexities exist domestically and, of course, internationally in other contexts as well. But whenever a term like reconciliation, 15 years ago, whenever a term sort of breaks through into the mainstream and starts to proliferate and be used, including by federal, provincial, territorial governments and other actors, it's on the one hand great because it's what Indigenous peoples have been advocating for. But on the other hand, there's the danger of, does anyone know what this means? And what's the danger of ignorance around it or certain elements of it? Well, that's why we do education and training, because it's an essential place for everyone to start, including First Nations.
Mm-hmm. Because there's so many, depending on the First Nation, there are so many protocols, for example.
Yeah.
That, and of course, with artists, anything, there's always that potential for cultural appropriation, or
absolutely
theft of work that then is suddenly printed on T-shirts and sold off, wherever, and that's what now artists are starting to look at this and determine how can OCAP be used in that context. How can we, like, for example, in my community, the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, where we don't have the same kind of imagery protocols. Mm-hmm. Ours are more about dance or song or mm-hmm. story. But at West, it's more about stylistically.
The form lines. Yeah.
Exactly. And only certain members of families are past that responsibility. Mm-hmm. Luann Neal, who was given that responsibility by her family. Mm-hmm. You are part of this clan, you use these forms, you don't use, killer whale, you don't use the other ones, you just use ours. Mm-hmm. And now it's your responsibility to take care of them. And so how can we use state of sovereignty to protect that kind of cultural responsibility?
Yeah, so this is so complicated, we will not cover it in an hour. And then there are many things that you and I can't say, right? Because you're coming from your perspective or perspectives. I'm coming from mine, personal and professional, which of course is not going to cover all of the diversity across and within First Nations across the country. But I do want to start with sort of acknowledging that, like, as long as we've had these OCAP principles, and as I said earlier, we're still always having to do the basic awareness, education, training work around those principles. There's a couple of really important caveats that people need to understand, right? It's in the name, principles, right? So this is a set of principles. It is not a set of standards or some other sort of codified legal framework or anything like that, right? So there are no OCAP police at the level of principles. And so what we like to say is people have to understand what these mean as principles, and then be able to answer the question of from principles to what. So if a rights holding collective, a First Nation or a First Nation community, depending on how they define the rights holding collective, and this is the essential term we'll come back to, I think, probably repeatedly through this conversation. If a rights holding collective takes up the OCAP principles and they give their definitions for what ownership, control, access, and possession means, and then they have people or organizations enter into agreements with them around those set of principles, then they've taken it from principle to something further, into some other type of assertion of OCAP, a practice of OCAP. So in that sense, we can get to the sort of the codified, air quotes around codified, the codified nature of these concepts. And so then there is the authority of whether it's the tribal council or the band council or the hereditary leadership, whatever the case may be, however they determine the leadership for these decisions for the rights holding collective, then it can move from principle into something that is much more of a practice or an assertion and even legal, right? Often what we see is, for example, a band council will agree to work with a researcher or a research initiative, and they enter into a legal agreement that includes OCAP, or where the community or nation has taken the principles as a starting place too. So that's the first and very important thing that people need to understand. And so both First Nations and anyone who would work with First Nations need to understand that. Only First Nations rights holding collectives can assert. Everyone else must respect, right? So those are the starting points for the OCAP conversation. Now, this conversation around rights holding collectives is super interesting when you get into communities of interest. So in the research world, as you know, we would call an artist community community of interest. That's the way it would be termed under the TCPS2, the Tri-Council Statement on research, right, with people, specific to Indigenous peoples. And so, what is the distinction between a rights holding collective and a community of interest? Well, when you get into the Indigenous spaces, it becomes complicated. And a lot of my work in the past has been working with and for Indian residential school survivors. And they are a community, right? A community of communities, you might say. There's certainly a national presence. There are big regional presences. I worked for several years I continue to work in support of the Shingwak residential school survivors. So the Shingwak School in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, I've long worked with and in support of them. That's a community. And, they came together in the 70s to first pierce the silence around residential schools and then advance the reclamation work that they wanted to advance, including reclaiming the space at what is now Algoma University. And so they should have rights over that information. But do they? Because if we say the rights holding collective is the place where the assertion of sovereignty is, including information sovereignty, what does that mean for a bunch of people from different communities and different nations who went to a residential school many years ago? Now that there's information around that school, where does the right over that information exist? So these are actually live questions that people who work in these spaces are trying to figure out. So the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia are having to take up these conversations around the survivor community and its rights over information, because otherwise, you have a document that lists a whole bunch of people with the identifiers next to them. This nation, this community, or these nations, this community connected to a person. Well, do we start slicing and dicing documents because of the different ways that the rights holding collective is represented? It's a really, really challenging concept. Now, what I've just done is a gross oversimplification of the issues. But as a starting point, I mean, that's what people need to understand is ultimately sovereignty is about being able to identify who has rights. And in the case of First Nations in Canada, there's the Algonquin Nation, many communities. In my context, right, as a member of the Huron-Wendat Nation, through my mother and grandmother, so the whole Bill C-31 legacy, there is one physical community and one nation, but there are people like in my case who, for many years, non-status Indian because of the gender discrimination in the Indian Act until, and this I'm very grateful for this, until the work of those women to change multiple times, to change the law, to allow people to come back to the nation and come back sometimes physically to the community. These are challenging questions.
Especially when you look at how it needs to be organized under an umbrella. Individual rights need to be organized under an umbrella. And that is a very Western way of having to deal with it. So again, we're up against that idea of how historically the Indigenous people would have dealt with this sort of thing. And it's crashing up against how Western says you have to have it this way. And how do we navigate that?
We do a lot of crashing up against. Yeah, that's exactly right. So Canada's information governance regime, the laws and policies of the land, speaking federally first and foremost here, from the Privacy Act to the Stats Act to the Access to Information Act to the Library and Archives Canada Act, like all of these things that set up Canada's information governance regime, for lack of a better term, the focus is on the individual's right? And this isn't to say, and again, a big caveat here, I'm not representative of all First Nations perspectives or even any one First Nations perspective. So I'm speaking in some generalities here, but First Nations, I have been taught, have always had the concept of an individual's rights, but have always had the concept of what are collective rights. And under traditional law, pre-contact, certainly under traditional law, there would have been the formal systems of accountability to understand the distinction between, and even when it gets very complicated, the distinction between an individual's right and when something is a collective right. And so when you talk about songs or dances, what I've been taught is that can exist within a family. It can exist within a clan, it can exist within a longhouse, and it can exist within a community, it can exist within a nation, right? And so from time immemorial, First Nations, in different ways, because of the incredible diversity across these lands from coast to coast to coast, First Nations had these concepts. Now, modern First Nations people and the modern nations and communities, we exist within, underneath, sometimes alongside or outside of Canadian law, but for the most part, very much under the heavy presence of Canadian law. And where the focus in terms of privacy, for example, is very much focused on the individual. What does it mean for a First Nation rights holding collective to assert sovereignty over information? And when you look at examples like whether it's material culture or the more ephemeral culture, like a song that has been recorded and exists in the archives or the collection of a national institution, the law permits it to be there, but the law also prevents the fullness of First Nations assertions of information sovereignty over the information. So we, in the 21st century, still have a long way to go to resolve these things.
It's the same with the copyright. Copyright law is based on the individual.
Absolutely, yeah.
When they did the review, Luann, I can't remember the other gentleman's name, and we all came in and we said, look, it's a collective.
Yeah.
It's not an individual right, it's a collective right.
Yeah.
It's a collective, it's not a right, it's stewardship.
Yeah.
And they came out with the report and said, yes, we have to look at this, and it's different in First Nations and Indigenous communities. And then, of course, the report has sat alongside the RCAP.
Yeah. Yeah, these are not new ideas. And whenever Canada does its certainly the public-facing work of revisiting its laws. So the Privacy Act had a review period a couple of years ago. I think the Access to Information one is still underway. So we'll have opportunities, you and I as individuals, as citizens, to contribute our thinking to that. Now, what does Canada take up and not take up? That's, of course, the live question. But we have been able, many, many, many of us, including us formerly at FNIGC, been able to identify this huge gap, right, of Canadian law cannot meet First Nations where First Nations say Canada needs to meet them until Canadian law changes. And the willingness to do that is questionable, at best. And so this idea of Canada advancing reconciliation, well, if the sacred cows, Canada's sacred cows are off limits, then how do we advance reconciliation?
Exactly. Especially when we're looking again at being such a resource-driven country, with Bill C5 and all the...
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, let's not go down that rabbit hole, and let's try to stick to the arts and culture side of things. But even that, things that are in the national interest. Well, culture's in the national interest, right?
Exactly.
It's a huge economic driver.
Yeah, it is, and to the detriment of Indigenous rights, of Indigenous lands, of Indigenous culture, and it's not just, and that benefits everyone. That's something that I always loved. What he was one of the commissioners, Littlechild.
Wilton Littlechild.
Chief
Wilton Littlechild. Yeah.
Yes. He said he was going to do a talk, and he said, "What do you want me to talk about?" And they said, "Whatever you like." And he said, "Okay, so I'm going to talk about treaty rights." And they said, "Oh, you're going to talk about your treaty rights?" And he said, "No, I'm going to talk about your treaty rights."
It's an agreement.
6-2 to treaty, right? Yeah. What does that mean on both sides of it? One of the things that I really am interested in with FNIGC is you have a data sovereignty research collaborative.
So that's brand new.
Yeah, this is amazing. When you look at how digital data, it's not just our materials or our culture that goes online, but also how it's used, how it's scraped, how it's presented, who presents it, and of course artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
How is it? I'm finishing up, hopefully by December. Well, no, by December.
well done. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be defending my thesis, and one of my chapters is artificial intelligence, and how Indigenous community, Indigenous nations, how we're impacted by that. Yeah. Because when you look at it, there's bias built right in. The coding is based on English. All coding is based on English. All annotations are built on these definitions that are based in the mainstream. You take the word, if we were to define words like settler, there's a completely different definition in Indigenous community than there is in mainstream community. And And yet AI is becoming so, I don't want to say insipid, but it's becoming so integrated into everything that we do, how we get a loan, how we get a mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
how we, it's all based on all this digital information, and how this artificial intelligence. I don't even think it. For one thing, it's not artificial intelligence. It's a chatbot, and it's not. Chat GPT is a program that allows you to have a conversation. It's not intelligent. But then there's the other side of things where they say, I was talking to Archer Pachowis, and he said that he wanted to see how far he could go with this artificial intelligence in discussing it with his elders. And he said, if I were to bring AI into a sweat lodge, how would we deal with that? And the elder thought about it for a while and finally said, we would deal with it like a younger sibling. It's a tool. It still falls under the respect and relationship and reciprocity that we have with everything else in creation.
Yeah, so I've said something similar when I participated in AI discussions, which is, what I was taught, which is we invite you into what is essentially systems of accountability. So whether it's membership or an invitation into something, say cultural, something laden with protocol, right? You're being invited into a system or systems of accountability. And those systems of accountability can hold human beings accountable. Not always perfectly, because we are humans and we make messes of things, but you can be held accountable. So a live question is, can an artificial intelligence be held accountable the way that a human being can be held accountable? And if it can't, then it is dangerous, because its presence is essentially, the theft. Like it's essentially, it is there to extract for its learning, which if it was me as a human, right, my learning, hopefully deeply personal, meaningful, right? But for an AI, it's none of those things, right? So in that sense, it's simply soaking up the way a sponge soaks up. And a sponge soaking up water, can't be held accountable. So yeah, deeply, deeply problematic. I'm so pleased that there are, amazing Indigenous thinkers out there like Jason Lewis, who are leading conversations around this, right? So much of this stuff flies over my head. We have to, be aware of it, because AI as a tool in information or data spaces is not only inevitable, it's already underway. So we have to always be, on top of it to the best of our ability to be on top of it. But it's changing rapidly, so we have to be on top of the literature. We have to engage with people who are experts, and there are some people who are taking AI in Indigenous spaces to really interesting and I would say absolutely challenging spaces, but not unlike artists have always done, right? Artists as transgressors, like Norval Morrisseau, right? Choosing to, create his own way of painting, and the way knowledges, enter his work. I have read, I never heard this directly from Norval Morrisseau himself, but I have read that, there were people who didn't love his approach to some things and considered him to be a transgressor of sorts. So, but transgressing in these ways to advance the culture, I think, is necessary and important. Again, if it's within these larger systems of accountability, then people can be held accountable. And so there are people taking these AI discussions in these equally challenging, if not even more challenging, directions. And I'm interested to see where some of those conversations go. Where we bump up against some of the immediate challenges is when we see a person or a usually for-profit entity, say, "Hey, First Nations, use this AI tool or this software as an expression of your data sovereignty." And it's like, well, hold on. A tool is a tool is a tool, right? So Sovereignty and information sovereignty are their own things. There's no software you can buy that takes you to information sovereignty. But you'll see more and more of this kind of thing online. So that's definitely one thing that people need to be aware of, that a tool is just that. It is a tool. But when you get to AI, or at least the way, Luddites like myself understand AI, the presence of AI, there are just some basic questions like, can I use AI without feeding AI? No, not really, because otherwise that's a closed system. That's a database, right? Information exists in a closed system. I'm accessing that closed system. Maybe there can be some machine learning built into it in a closed system. But typically when you use AI, whether you knowingly or unknowingly click the acknowledgement or the whatever I don't want to say informed consent, the terms and conditions. Yep. You click that little terms and conditions box. Whether you knowingly do that or unknowingly do that, if you're using AI, you're feeding AI. So, very dangerous, right? Particularly if you're trying to use it to advance, say, cultural revitalization goals of your community or your collective, and as a necessity of using the tool, you're entering things that are of your creation or coming from, the history of the collective. Well, that's all in there. It has been absorbed. There's no unlearning it. And then where does it go from there? Again, I'm grossly oversimplifying things. You've probably had guests who are much better equipped to talk about the complexities of this, but there are people taking the AI conversations in amazing and challenging directions. I think the good ones are absolutely grounded in the systems of accountability kind of conversation, but others aren't. And there will always be, not everyone in Indigenous country gets along and has the same idea on everything. So there will always be people who say, this is okay, and others who will say, no, it's not okay, or it's only okay in these contexts. And sometimes there's no perfect answer, right? What is a transgression to one is not necessarily a transgression to another. And I'm not sure how you resolve all of that when the capacity it takes, certainly intellectual capacity it takes, but also just the human capacity of being able to sit together, think through these things, move towards law, policy, practice, whatever it needs to be for a community, a nation, a collective. That it takes a lot of capacity. And, I think our communities are lacking capacity in so many areas. Where are the priorities? And in this particular area, I'd love to see it prioritized, but not at the cost of other essential priorities. And so it's a snake eating its own tail kind of situation.
And there's been a few projects pop up lately where people are looking at training AI in the language.
Yeah.
Creating their own AI and training it in the language. But for me, I question that, because the AI itself, and I don't know where it is that you start, where the scratch starts, because if it's software, or if you're just feeding or training something, it still has that basis for bias. And when you think about how words translate, I was at Skawanati's exhibit at the gallery.
Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. And there's one part where she talks about the three sisters, and I can't remember the word in Mohawk, but it translates as those who sustain us. So in English, it's three sisters, but in Mohawk, it's those who sustain us. So how do you train something to have that knowledge or that wisdom, I guess, to be able to have authentic?
Yeah, I would say integrity too, right? Integrity is a word we can apply to people, but that's because integrity is tied to systems of accountability. But can AI have integrity? Well, AI cheats, right? I know this very, very well in our work because it borders on, overlaps with scholarly and academic spaces. I also have two daughters in university who are the AI age, right? And they're very mindful of how it can be used as a tool and what they're not allowed to do, when they're writing papers or even doing research, right? But AI cheats. To help you get to the finish line, it will make up citations out of whole cloth, right? So if that logic exists in that example, it will also exist in the example you've just given, which is the AI may make up things. And so if you don't have the knowledge experts to essentially, do the quality assurance of what the AI is doing, you could go a long way in revitalizing your language with the wrong logic being applied to, if we knew this, then the AI tells us, this is the vocabulary that we can recreate, that it was lost, but now it's reclaimed. Well, I'm not a language expert, and so I'm sort of spitballing here, but, in this analogy, it's would the elders, current or past elders, say, yeah, that is the way these words were developed or would have been developed? I don't think so. Not if I've seen it cheat on behalf of a student trying to make a point in a paper.
Yeah, I've seen it where I was when I was first introduced to AI, ChatGPT, and we were putting together a draft proposal for a conference. And we asked it, okay, so what would you think of an Indigenous conference with artists, It came out with a whole schedule with people's names who don't exist. And it was terrible. It was like, like Karen Lightfeather and like all these Indigenous sounding, just like horror. Like I was horrified. I ran away and I wouldn't, even look at it for a long time. And it does cheat. It really does. And not having that accountability to be able to, or the language. Yeah. There was he's gone now, but there was an elder in my community who got everybody together, all the elders together, and said, okay, what would we call a microwave in our language? What would we call a TV in our language, or a computer in our language? Nobody could agree. Everybody kind of came up with their own words, what they thought it would be. But in the end, I think they only got one or two words because people just weren't agreeing on. So, I mean, if people can't agree ourselves, then how could an AI possibly say, here you go, this is it?
Yeah. I mean, it is exciting if you could trust AI. I mean, the upside is just unbelievable, right? And so it's solving that riddle of if we can hold people accountable and get them to be their best selves in this work, then that should be the litmus test. If we can do this to an AI, then it's worth doing. One of my first real jobs was with the Office of the Languages Commissioner of Nunavut. So Eva Ariak was then the commissioner. She went on to become the premier of Nunavut. But in those days, she was leading the conversations around the development of the Inuit Languages Act and the language revitalization work. And so I got to be like a fly on a wall for some of these conversations. Now, a non-Inuk who didn't speak Inuktitut, like challenging to be in a room all day when you don't necessarily know what's going on. But when things were translated for me or for other non-Inuktitut speakers, the work of the elders in this sort of consensus way to say, from my region, this is how we would have gone from these concepts to these words, to these more complex ways, and through that, able to reclaim language and create new words where new words need to be created. I mean, this is 20 years ago for me, or no, it's almost 25 years ago for me. But just absolutely amazing to have seen that play out in that context. And now, fast forward many years, to have met so many friends and colleagues along the way, certainly in professional spaces, who have also been involved in the language and culture revitalization. But, if you go back just, a decade, the only way to do it was people coming together with, sure, some digital tools to support, but it was all driven by the intelligences of the people present, right? But now in the room, and sometimes when you join a meeting, you'll see the AI, people have their AI note takers and whatnot joining. Now in the room is another intelligence, but I don't know if it's trustworthy yet. Certainly, coming back to that bell I keep ringing over and over again of the systems of accountability, does it have integrity the way an elder would require you to act with integrity? Prove to me that we've answered that question, and I'd be a lot more comfortable.
I don't think we have. I think it's going to be a long time before we do. Not only that, I would be terrified of that. Because if it can be accountable, that means it has self-awareness.
We cannot roll back the clock. That is the direction AI is going. AI will go further than our imaginations allow. And this is, after 50 plus years of amazing science fiction work that has included AI, that's the creative side of thinking about these things. But if you listen to the experts, we can't pretend that it won't go further than I think many of us are comfortable with. Mm-hmm. It's irreversible. The genie is out of the bottle.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that these kind of where data sovereignty and AI meet, are these the kind of research projects that FNIGC would consider doing?
So that's a good question. You mentioned our relatively new data sovereignty research collaborative. So like when I was talking about if people know FNIGC, it's probably because of the national survey work we do. We've also been given direction to do research and public health initiatives that align with First Nations priorities. So we've done a lot of that work over the years. And we've always tried to carve out space for, sort of the applied research. I reluctantly use the term think tank because I don't want to imply that FNIGC is a think tank. That can be a positive thing, and First Nations should have think tank spaces like Yellowhead Institute, among others. I don't want to imply that we are, but that sort of applied research think tank type space within FNIGC, we've long done it in sort of an ad hoc fashion, and we were able to make some strategic investments in the last year and a bit to resource the creation of a new unit at FNIGC, which we call this collaborative. And so this is the space where we are saying, again, I've given them quite a large charge, which is data sovereignty and everything underneath data sovereignty. Our job is to ensure that we are helping create quality information for First Nations so they can make informed decisions around issues. Issues related to data sovereignty, the OCAP principles, and beyond. So this unit is necessarily taking on questions of, OCAP at nearly 30 years. Where does it go from here? It is a set of principles, not a set of standards. It can move in the direction of a set of standards, but that's something that First Nations rights holders would need to choose. And there's certain type of work we would need to do. It could go beyond a set of standards to like a system of certification or accreditation, right? It could go in those directions, but only if rights holders wanted it to go in that direction. And then on the question of AI, we're scratching the surface out of necessity, and we will do some work on AI to help inform First Nations, but we are not the First Nations technology think tank. Certainly not the sole place where that thinking can happen. We'll do elements of it that align with the priorities that we've been given as an organization. Where I see the necessity of us digging deeper is in the implementation of this national data governance strategy that we were doing. So the background on that is First Nations have long advocated for a national data governance strategy. The National Chiefs and Assembly directed FNIGC in 2016 to develop the strategy. When I came on in 2017, that was a big focus of my work with the board of directors. We hired the people we needed to get us to the finish line on delivering the national strategy, which we did in March of 2020. And then in federal budget of 2021, there was a substantial amount of funding for First Nations in particular. Inuit and Métis, they're a little further behind than us in some of those areas, In our case, we had delivered the strategy, so we're able to move into implementation. So from federal budget 2021, there was phase one implementation funding. And so what that means is we've been able to put resources into each of the 10 First Nations regions. We call them data champion teams. And these are the teams that are carrying the conversations regionally with leadership and the grassroots and the thought leadership around, what does a by First Nations, for First Nations information governance system look like in your region? What does a by First Nations, for First Nations statistical services system in your region look like? And the idea of doing this in the 10 regions puts the work closer to the sovereignty of the nations. Now, it will have to exist as a network of regional centers, and then collectively at the national level, we would continue to do the kind of work we're doing, but also we'd be in a position, certainly technically in a position, to do more of this kind of work, or more focused. And so it's in those in development spaces where the role of AI is going to be really, really important. And, because if we're talking about, again, in somewhat simple terms, a First Nations-led information governance system and a First Nations-led statistical system, we, like a Statistics Canada, Canada's system, will have to be accountable to all of the laws and policies that we have to be accountable to, but beyond that as well, the protocols of First Nations around what's right and not right. And so AI is a Wild West. So we necessarily have to be advancing that in the same way that StatsCan or CIHI is thinking about how is AI a tool for us? How does AI allow us to do our vision, mission, objectives better? We're doing the same type of work, but the First Nations considerations are different, and they will be unique for some First Nations, and not the same coast to coast to coast necessarily. So it's I use the Wild West analogy, which I don't love. We'll come up with a better analogy that is much more positive for how First Nations are working in this space of uncertainty.
Space, the final frontier.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And I'm wondering about that. How protocols, is it possible, do you think, to create an Indigenous AI, like an enclave that is deeply rooted in, there are some principles within the Indigenous community that are similar, but I love that idea of the regional aspect, because then you're taking into account distinction based.
Yeah, absolutely.
And can we do that? Is that something
so
we could do?
Of course, it is theoretically possible, and conceptually probably probably dozens of ways you could come at that. So yes, theoretically, there's no question, right? The sky isn't even the limit, right?
Yeah.
Whatever is beyond the sky is the limit, or that is to say, it's probably limitless. So if you hear the experts talk about AI, they talk about it in this limitless kind of way, right? So theoretically, can there be an Indigenous AI? Of course, theoretically, of course. Now, that's as far as my expertise talking about this stuff goes. I have read that, yes, of course, it's theoretically possible, but what does it really mean? Conceptually, because you'd have to land on, which approaches, and then what does it actually mean in practice? But I think somebody should be investing very significantly in the from theory to practice work around Indigenous AI. Now we get into the very thorny question of investment. Where does it come from? What are the strings that are attached to it? How can all of this work, in the sort of the holistic circle that we're taught that we should always be thinking about, how can we ensure that this work, which is essential and important, is done with those sort of core values and principles of like people being held accountable in systems of accountability, and Indigenous AI would have to be built to be unassailably integrity-based as an Indigenous AI. Again, I go back to sort of I'm mixing metaphors and analogies here, but sort of going back to the tail eating its snake, right? snake eating its tail. The
You're
snake
right.
eating its tail is where do we start? Where's the danger? Are we even aware? Are we too far along in certain journeys? Again, now I'm out of my depth.
I think that's a really interesting idea, to take it from the theory, um, and I think that accountability piece. Yeah, you're right. It has to be baked in. Are we depending on? Would it be depending on, as an Algonquin, I sign in as an Algonquin, and then it runs during using my protocols as an Algonquin,
So you're
or
getting into models now, right? You're going from theoretically to
yeah,
conceptually, and then choosing models for actually going from theory into practice, right? So I know people are doing this work, but what would it mean for? Let's just stay in the Canadian context for
yeah,
Indigenous AI in the Canadian context, getting hundreds of First Nations together, Inuit, the Métis Nation, or
yeah,
perhaps we have to be doing elements of this or all of it separately, truly distinctions based. The It is really easy to come up with all of the problems to even thinking about this theoretically. Moving from the theory to the practice is, well, again, it's mind-boggling.
yeah. There's a huge gap between that we don't have answers for right now, because I mean, all kinds of questions start racing through my brain about, well, if you're Algonquin and you sign in as a Mohawk, where you're using those protocols, like, is that ethical? Is,
But how else would the sovereignty come in, right?
yeah, but if
So if that AI space, so unless you're building a strictly Algonquin AI
yeah,
versus a strictly Haudenosaunee
yeah,
AI versus a strictly Huron-Wendat AI, or a strictly Haida AI, right? If we're coming together in this space and moving up from the distinctions of nations to the collective First Nations to the even more collective Indigenous, where does the sovereignty come in? How would there be assertions of sovereignty over information in that space if that's not identifiable by the artificial intelligence? Now we can do that as humans, right? If a bunch of us are in a room, and we're poking away at a problem together, and somebody says, my protocols are, we don't discuss this way, and somebody else says, oh, well, we don't have those protocols. Sometimes that's a really rich conversation, and sometimes it's a conversation where you sort of crash up against it. It's I'll only sit in a circle if we go this way, and I'll only sit in a circle if we go that way, right? We know human beings do that, right? So, but as human beings working in systems of accountability, again, I'm ringing the same bell over and over again. We find our way to negotiating well, if we're coming at these things with different teachings, different protocols, I was taught this, you were taught that, how do we go forward? Turn to an elder to help us maybe mitigate, right? I have to assume that would be built into the artificial intelligence, the method of the artificial intelligence. Otherwise, you can't get to assertion of sovereignty.
exactly.
Because like you and I can't go walking down the street saying we are asserting sovereignty because you're Algonquin and I'm not.
Yeah, because your assertion of sovereignty, I mean, is completely different than what I'm looking at, as far as the territory where, if we're walking in Ottawa, you know.
Yeah, I'm just your ally in these lands.
Hmm. Yeah. It reminds me, in my community, we have what's called the Pike Constitution, and it's a mnemonic device. They take the different bones of the pike, and one's a pipe, and one's a fire. They
Mm-hmm.
create little um, dioramas, really, like little images from the bones, and each of these images, each of these little things, um, means something. Like fire is your vision. The pipe is sacred. How you're communicating with the creator, and the governance structure is very egalitarian in that you use this structure, this governance model, to govern yourself. but by extension, it also governs the community.
Mm-hmm.
Because if everyone is governing themselves basing on these principles, then that government then becomes what governs the community and the principles that govern the community. And so I'm wondering if we look at it that way, from various nations' point of view, everyone has their own way of governance, but I mean, we can't anticipate every single situation. We just can't. You're right. The accountability would have to be, there would have to be something in the AI that says, well, if, the Mohawks do it, or the Haudenosaunee or the Huron-Wendat, they do it this way, and have that information at hand, but also the respect that each are sovereign. And that would have to be baked in.
Yeah. So again, theoretically, I don't see any reason why the human beings who build can't build towards those goals. I don't. Yeah. Again, I'm out of my depth.
Yeah, me too.
Past saying that. I will say this. I'm a little embarrassed that we've gone this far into the conversation and I haven't talked about governance when it's in the name of the organization that I lead. But yeah, that's what we were getting at, right? Was right. There's the way we need to govern ourselves, and then there's when we step into these systems that necessarily have a governance system to them. We must have the information. We must know what the system is and our role within the system, and then we step into it. So like an organization that chooses to govern itself a particular way, in the Western context, we have, the articles of incorporation, the objects of the corporation, the necessity for a set of bylaws, and from bylaws, the governance system, the board of directors, for example, and then boards can come up with the tools that they use to further govern themselves beyond the law of incorporation, using that sort of Canadian Corporations Canada kind of context, right? So you enter into that. You should be entering into it knowing you're signing on to that, and you're agreeing to act within that. And if you try to act outside of that, the other people in the system will hold you accountable. In sovereign nation spaces and cultural spaces where there are laws, policies, and structures, I think something very, very similar would happen. Like when I've been invited into somebody's lodge, right? Sometimes I'm not smart enough to ask what I need to know, and people are generous and they tell me, you do this, not that, and you learn with humility. But you are very quickly into the system. You're being taught how to behave, and it's all about being accountable beyond oneself in this larger system of governing the behavior, or governing the momentum towards the objective, right? Can we get an AI to do that? Yeah, theoretically, of course we can. Or I would love you to have a guest that says otherwise. In fact, Jonathan, I would challenge you to say, maybe theoretically we can't get there. So, I mean, it's such an open question, particularly for, people who aren't AI experts. Yeah, I'm a little surprised that I've had this much to say about AI not being an expert. So well, forgive me.
No, you're making it very accessible for people who aren't. I am not an AI expert, and I found what you were saying has helped me to understand, have a deeper understanding, because you're speaking about it in a plain way that is very understandable. So that really helps.
Okay, well, I backed into that, but thank you. Thank you for the compliment.
That's okay. That's true. You're right, though. There would be. There's so many other. And also, once I started thinking about the research around that, I started thinking about all the other research about all data is information and information is everything. I really love that. If you don't mind, I might use that. It's
Well, it's been said many different ways by different people, so I make no claim to it. But yeah, data, I mean, people sometimes get hung up on the nomenclature, right? Data, we typically mean information that is quantifiable, but information is everything, right? So nothing can happen without generating information, right? Even you in a vacuum, if that was possible for you to be floating in a vacuum, there's still laden with information.
Yep. That's true. That's absolutely true. One of the things that I found really interesting about what you guys do is the knowledge translation. Can you explain that a little bit to me?
Yeah. So again, this idea of getting caught up in the nomenclature. So our job is to collect information, to analyze information, and to report out on that in service of First Nations needs and objectives, right? So a health survey should be about collecting the right information to tell a particular story. For us, it's strictly at the national level. Our regional partners and the nations would tell regional and or sub-regional stories from that information. But there's it's so complex working with information, particularly when some of the information is quantitative, statistical, and others is qualitative, right? You are, sharing people's perspectives on things. We do a mix of that, of qualitative and quantitative work. And so there's always the need to be able to communicate the results of your work. And it can be very, very technical. And all good information communicators understand the need to speak in plain language, to communicate effectively in plain language. So plain language is one part of what we're talking about. But knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, right? These terms, which can be the same in some contexts, can overlap in other contexts, can be quite different in other contexts. I think people do get caught up on, well, this says knowledge engagement, and that must be different than knowledge mobilization, and that must be different than knowledge translation. It is true that those things can be defined differently, but if anchor yourself in the context within which you work and find out what they really mean in the context you're working. So even at FNIGC, we use the language of knowledge engagement, we use the language of knowledge mobilization, we use the language of knowledge translation. Knowledge translation typically means, in our case, as a First Nations organization communicating primarily to First Nations, is that we effectively translate information in appropriate ways, right? And that's not as simple as dumbing it down into plain language. It's if something needs to be said more effectively for a First Nations audience in a particular way, or subsets of First Nations audiences, then it takes the expertise to do that translation, to say it in a way that it can be best received by the audience, who would then use it to make informed decisions, like say at a community level, right? If the health survey says XYZ, it can be taken up by a First Nations community to make important decisions.
So how would data sovereignty be, how would knowledge translation be used in the case of data sovereignty?
So again, it is a nation's sovereignty. So the rights holding collective can assert sovereignty, which includes sovereignty over information. Now, when you're talking about a national survey, right, where individuals in discrete communities connected to one or more nations in a region participate in a national survey, and their information is rolled up, de-identified, rolled up at a regional level, and then rolled up again, de-identified at the national level. All of a sudden, we're saying, when FNIGC talks about that work, we're saying the First Nations picture is, the First Nations picture is, the First Nations picture is, which is to say the national picture, right? We're not saying that the Algonquins of Barrier Lake have this rate of diabetes. We're not saying that. We can't. Like it's not the mandate we've been given. And so in rolling up the information to report out at a national level, yeah, it's a really essential question for people to ask. So where is the assertion of data sovereignty by nations in that? Well, you have to go back to the very beginning, the conceptualization of the initiative, the development and design of the initiative, and all the work that goes into creating the survey that is used. So a person, makes an informed consent to participate in the survey. Well, a network of people across the country representing all of our partners have come together to design the questionnaire to be in line with assertions of information sovereignty. So this whole idea of the information rolls up, de-identified, and rolls up again to the national level is an assertion of sovereignty, saying like, once you get outside of this context, we can give a delegated authority to a First Nations-led organization like FNIGC to be the stewards of this information under this very strict legal agreement. And if they go outside of that, they're in trouble, right? So we as an organization could do no assertion of First Nations data sovereignty, but it's been built in, baked in. It's part of the DNA of the whole initiative. Sometimes we make mistakes and we do things wrong and have to come back together as a network to say, where did we go wrong? And let's start over.
Well, it sounds like it's a very thorough and thoughtful.
It would be even more thorough if we had the level of investment required to do this kind of work, right? So we've been given a narrow lane to operate within because that's what First Nations have been able to convince the government to fund to date. The aspiration is much, much bigger, and you see that aspiration in the implementation of the National Data Governance Strategy. I don't know if Canada, will match the level of aspiration in terms of their support. The rhetoric is good, and there's been a lot of really good indication of support. It used to be one national survey. I mean, during the Harper years, we grew to have a second national survey. I think surprise to some people, when so many things were being cut under that government, including two organizations I worked for, NAHO and the Healing Foundation, both disappeared under that government. But FNIGC took on an additional national survey. So, the First Nations bureaucrats and the government bureaucrats, convinced the political powers that this was an important investment. And lo and behold, we saw that realized. More recently, we've been given, a mandate to develop a child well-being longitudinal survey. So returning to that initial idea of a First Nations-led longitudinal survey. And so that's development work that we're beginning. So now, 3 national surveys in our national survey program. So there's been a lot of really, really good support. First Nations aspiration is to do much more, and we need a willing partner. And we will only be able to move at the speed of that nation-to-nation relationship.
Mm-hmm. So hopefully over the next few years, is private investment anything that would ever be considered? Or?
So, I mean, not for us. We've been set up as a national not-for-profit. My personal opinion is it's not advisable to do that for the kind of work we've been mandated to do. An analogy that I use is, First Nations should be afforded the opportunity to build their institutions in the same manner that Canada builds its institutions, which is, the public via its representatives, dig into an issue, determine the best way forward, usually pass legislation to enable, and then that legislation enables a building period. And then from the building, you go into the fulfillment of the mandate, right? That's how Kai was built, in the last 20, 25 years, among other examples. First Nations are not usually afforded the opportunity to build their institutions that way. And so that's a switch we could flip. But again, that's so far above my head as somebody who, runs this one particular organization. I'll keep reminding people that that's theoretically, conceptually, and I think practicably possible for Canada in its nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations to say, we need First Nations to have their institutions, and there are better ways to enable the building of them. In the meantime, we continue to do the best work we can, and usually it's excellent, to advance the institution building imperatives that we have been given to advance. And there's a lot of examples of that across First Nations country, nationally and regionally.
I've been hearing that in the arts for years, 20, 30 years. I've been hearing that, where we need to have our own national arts center.
Oh, yeah. So that's a super exciting one. Would we want it to be a Canadian institution, or would we want it to be wholly our own institution, or some sort of hybrid in the middle? These are, again, it's not just theoretically possible, it is absolutely practicable.
Yeah, exactly.
That is to say, doable.
Yeah.
But it costs a lot of money and political capital.
Absolutely. Well, we can always keep working at it.
Yeah. I would love to see that in my lifetime, that's for sure.
Me too. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for talking with me today. I always enjoy our conversations.
Oh, me too.
I go off. I'm sorry I did. I took us off on a tangent, but
Hey, I indulged you, so no worries.
Miigwech. Miigwech. Thanks for speaking with us today. And I'd like to, return to this conversation at some point as well.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I'd love to hear, if people listen to our conversation and are able to poke at some of the things that we said and come up with better ways of saying them, or even correcting things that we've said that maybe lead to misconceptions. That's why we do these things publicly, right? It's a way to be held accountable.
Absolutely. Thank you.